Have you ever wondered how a single ship could terrorize an entire navy without ever firing a shot in a major fleet engagement? Most legends are born in the thunder of broadsides, but the story of the KMS Tirpitz is a haunting masterpiece of psychological warfare and cold, calculated isolation. She was the lonely queen of the north, a gargantuan mountain of steel that cast a shadow longer than the very fjords she called home. To Adolf Hitler, she was a vital insurance policy. To Winston Churchill, she was a personal obsession that had to be erased from the face of the earth. The fascination with the Tirpitz lies in her secret of presence, the terrifying reality that her mere existence forced the Allies to divert countless resources. My name is a whisper of the freezing winds now, but I remember the chilling aura of the Norwegian coast where the giants slept. We spent years watching the horizon, waiting for a monster that lived in the mist and ruled through the power of fear alone. The fascination with the Tirpitz began the moment she moved into the jagged, snow-capped sanctuaries of the Norwegian fjords in early 1942. The psychological weight of her arrival was felt instantly by the merchant sailors of the Arctic convoys, who knew that death was now only a horizon away. The secret flaw of the Allied strategy was the constant need to protect against a breakout that might never actually happen in the open sea. We saw the British Admiralty scramble every time a reconnaissance photo showed a ripple in the water near her heavy and armored hull. The fascination of the ship was her stillness, a predatory crouch that kept dozens of Allied battleships tied down in the home fleet. She was a ghost that haunted the planning rooms of London, a metallic nightmare that required no ammunition to inflict a strategic defeat. We were living in a game of chess where the most powerful piece on the board refused to move, yet controlled everything. The air in the fjords was always cold, but the presence of the Tirpitz made the very water feel like it was made of ice. The psychological weight of the fleet in being doctrine was a heavy burden for the German crew who spent years trapped in the narrow mountain passes. The fascination of life aboard the Tirpitz was a strange mixture of absolute luxury and a soul-crushing boredom that ate away at the men. The secret flaw of her mission was the isolation, as the sailors were surrounded by a hostile local population and a landscape that offered no escape. We saw the massive 50,000-ton hull reflected in the mirror-still waters of the fjord, a sight that was both majestic and deeply unnatural. The fascination of the ship's maintenance was a constant struggle against the salt and the freezing damp that threatened to corrode her complex guts. We spent our days polishing brass and checking shells for a battle that felt like it would never truly arrive for the giant. The Tirpitz was a queen in a cage, a masterpiece of naval architecture that was being slowly suffocated by the very mountains meant to protect her. We were the guardians of a secret weapon that was increasingly becoming a prisoner of its own formidable and massive reputation. I remember the secret flaw of the artificial fog systems, the chemical smoke screens that would wrap the ship in a toxic green cloud whenever bombers appeared. The fascination of the fjord's defense was the way the landscape itself was used to hide the giant from the prying eyes of the RAF. The psychological weight of the green mist was terrifying, as men on deck would vanish into a swirling haze where they couldn't see their own hands. We heard the drone of the British engines high above the peaks, a sound that signaled another attempt to kill the monster in her sleep. The fascination of the camouflage was the way we painted the hull to blend with the rocks and the snowy cliffs of the north. We were trying to make a 50,000-ton battleship invisible, a task that required miles of netting and a desperate reliance on the weather. The Tirpitz was a shapeshifter, a ghost that could disappear into the granite shadows of Norway at a moment's notice. Every alarm was a reminder that we were being hunted by a nation that would not rest until we were at the bottom. The psychological weight of the Arctic convoys was the most direct result of the Tirpitz's presence, as the secret flaw of convoy PQ-17 tragically proved. The fascination of that disaster was the power of a rumor. The mere report that the Tirpitz had left her berth caused the convoy to scatter. The psychological weight of that decision led to the slaughter of defenseless merchant ships by submarines and aircraft across the freezing and dark sea. We hadn't even engaged the enemy, yet our presence had caused more destruction than a full broadside from our massive 15-inch guns ever could. The fascination of the German command was their caution, as they feared losing the Tirpitz more than they valued the potential of her victories. We were a weapon of intimidation, a psychological hammer that fell on the Allied morale without ever needing to strike a physical blow. The ship was a legend of terror, a name that made the bravest sailors tremble when they heard it whispered over the radio. We sat in our fjord, a silent audience to the carnage we had caused simply by existing in the shadows. I often think about the secret flaw of the British obsession with us, which led to some of the most daring and innovative raids in naval history. The fascination of the X-craft midget submarines was a testament to the lengths Churchill would go to wound the lonely queen in her lair. The psychological weight of the underwater threat was constant, as we dropped depth charges into the still water every hour to deter the divers. We felt the jolt of the explosions beneath our feet, a reminder that the enemy was literally crawling under our hull to plant their mines. The fascination of the damage was the internal shock, as the massive battleship was lifted and dropped by the force of the submerged charges. We were wounded, not by a fleet but by a handful of brave men in tiny metal tubes who had traveled thousands of miles. The Tirpitz was no longer untouchable, her secret flaw of vulnerability at anchor having been exploited by the sheer will of the British. We spent months repairing the giant in the freezing dark, our pride stung by an enemy we never even saw on the surface. The fascination with the Tirpitz's recovery was a miracle of engineering performed under the most extreme conditions imaginable in the Arctic Circle. The psychological weight of the repair work was immense, as divers worked in the freezing darkness to patch the holes in the heavy armor. The secret flaw of our position was the lack of a proper dry dock, forcing us to invent ways to fix the giant while she was still afloat. We saw the ingenuity of the German engineers as they built cofferdams against the hull, a desperate effort to restore the Queen to her throne. The fascination of the ship's resilience was a source of hope for the crew, a belief that the Tirpitz was truly blessed by the gods of war. But the psychological weight of the repairs was balanced by the knowledge that as soon as we were fixed, the bombers would return to kill us. We were in a cycle of destruction and rebirth, a dance of steel and explosives that was draining the resources of a dying empire. The Tirpitz was a drain on the nation, a beautiful and expensive monster that was eating our future while we waited for the end. I remember the secret flaw of the fuel shortages, which began to turn our majestic giant into a stationary battery of guns rather than a mobile warship. The fascination of the logistics was a grim reality, as the oil needed for one sortie could have fueled a dozen divisions on the Eastern Front. The psychological weight of the stationary queen was a blow to our morale, as we realized we were slowly becoming a fort rather than a fleet. We watched the fuel gauges drop and the mountains of coal disappear, a silent admission that the German Navy was running out of time and energy. The fascination of the ship's role shifted to being a floating anti-aircraft platform, her massive guns now aimed at the sky instead of the horizon. We were a mountain of steel that was rooted to the spot, a giant that had lost its legs but still possessed its terrifying and powerful bite. The Tirpitz was a monument to a strategy that had failed, a queen whose kingdom had shrunk to the size of a single Norwegian fjord. Every day the sun stayed down longer, and every day the sense of our inevitable and tragic end grew colder. The psychological weight of the tall boy bombs was the final and most terrifying chapter in the hunt for the lonely queen of the North. The fascination of these 6-ton earthquakes was their ability to penetrate even the thickest armor plating that Krupp steel could provide us. The secret flaw of our armor was that it was designed for shells, not for a vertical strike from a 5-mile-high Lancaster bomber in the sky. We heard the scream of the falling steel, a sound that was different from anything we had ever experienced in the previous and long years of war. The fascination of the impact was the way the earth itself shook, as the bombs that missed the ship created tidal waves in the narrow fjord. We were trapped in a bowl of stone, a target that couldn't move while the British perfected the art of dropping mountains on our heads. The Tirpitz was a giant being stoned to death by a persistent and invisible enemy that we couldn't reach or even see. We felt the psychological weight of the finality, the realization that the unsinkable legend was finally being dismantled by the power of gravity. As the first part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the Tirpitz remains a story of what might have been and what never was. The psychological weight of her history is the tragedy of a ship that was too powerful to use and too important to lose in the dark. The secret flaw of the giant was revealed in her isolation, a reminder that a weapon without a purpose is just a very expensive and beautiful tomb. We are the guardians of her ghost, the ones who remember the smell of the green smoke and the cold of the Norwegian salt water. The fascination of the Tirpitz is her silence, a queen who ruled the north without ever needing to speak the language of the cannons. We prepare for the final plunge, for the moment when the mountains could no longer hide the monster from the light of the dawn. The story of the Tirpitz is a story of fear, and fear is a weapon that eventually turns on the one who tries to wield it. We were the crew of the Lonely Queen, and our watch was about to end in a roar of steel and ice. The fascination with the Norwegian winter was the way the polar night became a physical entity that wrapped itself around the KMS Tirpitz like a shroud. The psychological weight of the 4-month darkness was a slow poison to the crew's morale, as the sun vanished and left us in a world of perpetual twilight and bitter frost. The secret flaw of our existence was the total sensory deprivation, where the only thing we could hear was the groaning of the ice against our massive armored hull. We saw men staring into the black water for hours, their minds drifting away from the war and toward the distant warm hearths of a Germany that was being burned to the ground. The fascination of the ship's interior was its warmth, a manufactured sanctuary of steam and light that felt increasingly disconnected from the reality of the freezing fjord. We were living in a steel bubble, a community of thousands trapped in a silent, white wasteland where time seemed to have stopped its forward march. The psychological weight of the isolation was the true enemy, a quiet thief that stole the sharp edge of our discipline and replaced it with a heavy and listless despair. I remember the secret flaw of our proximity to the shore, where the towering cliffs of the fjord created a radar shadow that both protected and blinded the giant. The fascination of the tactical environment was its intimacy. We were so close to the mountains that the echo of our daily bugle calls would bounce off the granite and return to us like a ghostly greeting. The psychological weight of the land-locked battleship was a constant reminder that we had become a stationary fort, rather than a soaring queen of the Atlantic. We watched the local Norwegian resistance through our binoculars, knowing they were counting every crate of supplies and every puff of smoke from our funnels. The fascination of the espionage was the feeling of being watched by 1,000 invisible eyes, each one a direct line to the Admiralty in London. We were a secret that everyone knew, a giant hiding behind a curtain of glass that was being tapped on by the fingers of a determined and patient enemy. Every shadow on the hillside was a potential spy, and every light in a distant cabin was a signal that could bring the bombers back to our narrow and icy doorstep. The psychological weight of the operation's source, aftermath, remained a deep and jagged wound in the pride of the German engineering staff aboard the ship. The fascination of the X-Craft attack was the sheer audacity of the British divers who had navigated the maze of our anti-submarine nets in the dark. The secret flaw of our defense was our over-reliance on physical barriers, which couldn't stop a man with enough courage and a small enough vessel to slip through the gaps. We spent weeks in the dark, submerged engine rooms, trying to realign the massive turbines that had been shifted by the underwater earthquake of the mines. The fascination of the repair effort was the desperation, a race against time before the British realized how truly crippled their Lonely Queen had actually become. We were a giant with a broken back, pretending to be strong while the workers hammered and welded in the freezing mud of the hull's lowest and darkest compartments. The psychological weight of the vulnerability was absolute, as we realized that the mountains were not a shield, but the walls of a trap that was slowly closing in. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's primary armament, those massive 15-inch guns that were masterpieces of Krupp steel but lacked the targets they were built to destroy. The fascination of the silent cannons was the psychological toll on the gunners, who spent years practicing for a fleet engagement that would never materialize in the North Sea. The psychological weight of the ammunition was a constant concern, as the shells were heavy, expensive, and increasingly difficult to replace as the German railway system collapsed. We fired them occasionally at the mountains to clear the snow or to test the recoil, a thunderous sound that felt like a scream of frustration from the ship itself. The fascination of the ballistic power was a hollow comfort when the enemy chose to fight us with midget submarines, long-range bombers, and invisible shadows of the night. We were a duelist with a heavy sword in a room full of mosquitoes, A giant who could crush a city but couldn't touch the hand that was slowly tightening the noose. The Tirpitz was a masterpiece of obsolescence, a beautiful and terrifying relic of a war that had moved beyond the reach of her massive and slow-moving barrels. The fascination with the arrival of the Barracuda dive bombers during Operation Tungsten was the moment the sky itself seemed to turn into a rain of fire and screaming metal. The psychological weight of the surprise was a physical shock, as the British aircraft cleared the mountain peaks and dove before our anti-aircraft crews could even reach their stations. The secret flaw of our position was the limited reaction time afforded by the narrow fjords, which gave the attackers a perfect and high-altitude path to our deck. We saw the bombs falling like black eggs from the bellies of the planes, hitting the superstructure and the bridge with a series of rhythmic and violent and deafening explosions. The fascination of the carnage was the sight of the heavy armor being shredded by smaller hits, 1,000 splinters of steel turning the deck into a lethal and bloody and terrifying trap. We fought back with everything we had, the sky filled with the tracers of our 20mm cannons, but the swarm was too fast and too determined to be stopped. The Tirpitz was a bleeding giant, her paint scorched and her decks littered with the broken remains of her defenders and her proud and long-held dignity. I remember the secret flaw of the ship's medical bay, which was quickly overwhelmed by the number of casualties from the strafing fire of the British carrier planes. The fascination of the triage was the quiet professionalism of the doctors, who worked under the flickering emergency lights as the ship shuddered from the near misses. The psychological weight of the injuries was a heavy burden for the crew, seeing our brothers mangled by a force that didn't even have to risk its own battleships to wound us. We realized then that the Lonely Queen was being picked apart piece by piece, a slow and agonizing execution that was being watched by the indifferent and cold peaks of the fjord. The fascination of the survival was the way the hull remained intact, the thick belt of Krupp steel protecting our vital organs, while our skin was being burned away. But a ship is more than its hull. It is the men who breathe life into the iron, and our breath was becoming short and ragged as the pressure of the hunt intensified. Every alarm was a scar on our collective psyche, a reminder that we were a target that the world would never allow to escape into the open and free sea. The psychological weight of the petard and tall boy rumors began to circulate among the crew, as the British perfected their heavy-lift bombing capabilities in the late war years. The fascination of the science was terrifying, as we heard of bombs that didn't just explode, but created localized earthquakes to buckle the plates of the hull from below. The secret flaw of our harbor defense was that we were a stationary target, a giant whose coordinates were etched into the maps of every bomber squadron in the Royal Air Force. We watched the sky with a new kind of dread, knowing that the mountains were no longer high enough to protect us from the reach of the Lancaster's heavy and lethal wings. The fascination of the engineering was our only hope, as we built more smoke generators and increased the thickness of our anti-torpedo nets around the ship. We were a fortress that was being reinforced, even as the ground beneath us was being dug away by the persistence of an obsessed and vengeful enemy. The Tirpitz was a symbol of the German Reich, immense, imposing, and increasingly surrounded by the fire of a world that refused to be intimidated by her size. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's morale during the long periods of repair, where the men were forced to work in the dark, oily water of the double bottom. The fascination of the labor was the way it kept the panic at bay, the physical exhaustion serving as a shield against the psychological weight of our certain and coming destruction. We heard the sounds of the war on the radio, the fall of cities and the retreat of the armies, and we realized that our lonely queen was a queen of a vanishing and broken empire. The fascination of our loyalty was a mystery even to us, a mechanical devotion to the iron that had become our only home and our only reality in the north. We were the Tirpitz men, a breed apart from the rest of the Navy, bound together by the shared experience of the fog, the frost, and the endless and silent waiting. But even the strongest bond has its breaking point, and the weight of the years was beginning to crush the spirit of the men who manned the guns. We were a ship of ghosts, sailing a fjord of shadows, waiting for the final blow that would release us from the burden of our massive and heavy reputation. The fascination with the move to Tromsø was the final and desperate attempt to use the Tirpitz as a floating battery to defend northern Norway against an Allied invasion. The psychological weight of the relocation was the realization that we were no longer a threat to the convoys, but a sacrificial lamb meant to buy time for a retreating and dying army. The secret flaw of the new berth was the shallow water, which was supposed to prevent us from sinking but instead made us a perfect and stable target for the heavy bombers. We felt the change in the air, a sense of finality that was as cold as the Arctic wind that blew through the open hatches of the superstructure. The fascination of the landscape was its openness, a lack of the high peaks that had shielded us for so long in the narrow and deep waters of the southern fjords. We were exposed, a giant on a pedestal of sand, waiting for the heavy hitters of the RAF to find us in the pale and weak light of the autumn sun. The Tirpitz was a queen who had lost her palace, a monster that was finally out of places to hide in the vast and indifferent and cold and dark north. As the second part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the Tirpitz remains a study in the slow and agonizing death of a naval giant in the dark. The psychological weight of her presence was fading, replaced by the reality of her vulnerability and the persistence of the hunters who never lost her scent. The secret flaw of the lonely queen was her loneliness itself, a lack of support that left her to face the fury of a nation alone in the cold. We prepared for the final winter, but we knew in our hearts that the ice would not be the only thing to break the ship in the coming months. The fascination of the history is the way it narrows down to a single ship and a single fate, a tragedy of scale that was about to reach its thunderous and final and violent climax. We were the crew of the Tirpitz, and we were standing on the edge of the abyss, waiting for the mountain of steel to fall for the very last time. The air was silent, the water was still, and the end was written in the stars above the freezing and dark and quiet fjords. The fascination with our final move to Tromsø was a bittersweet realization that the lonely queen was no longer a predator, but a wounded beast seeking a place to die. The psychological weight of the new anchorage was the sudden loss of the towering cliffs that had been our only reliable shield against the sky for years. The secret flaw of this final berth was the shallow water, which was intended by the High Command to keep the ship from sinking completely if she was hit. We saw the sandbanks beneath our hull as a promise of safety, a belief that even a mortal wound would leave our guns above the surface to keep on fighting. But the fascination of the terrain was its treachery, as the soft seabed offered no stable foundation to support the weight of a 50,000-ton giant under pressure. We were a fortress built on a pedestal of silt, exposed to the wide and open horizon of the northern sky where the hunters were already gathering. The psychological weight of the exposure was a cold hand on our hearts, a feeling that the curtain of the mountains had been pulled back for the final and tragic act. I remember the secret flaw of the sandbank construction, where thousands of tons of earth were dredged to create a platform that would supposedly hold the ship upright. The fascination of the labor was the desperation of the German engineers, who were trying to turn a battleship into a stationary island in the middle of a collapsing war. The psychological weight of the stationary battery roll was a final blow to the pride of the sailors who still dreamed of the open and free Atlantic. We watched as the nets were laid and the smoke generators were positioned, a defensive ring that felt more like the walls of a mausoleum than the armor of a warship. The fascination of the stillness was eerie, a quiet that was only broken by the sound of the wind and the distant muffled thud of the Arctic Sea. We were waiting for a storm that we knew was coming from the west, a rain of steel that would finally test the secret flaw of our shallow water sanctuary. Every man on deck scanned the clouds with a desperate intensity, knowing that the next shadow to cross the sun would be the one that brought the end. The psychological weight of the tallboy bombs had become a legend of terror among the crew, long before we saw them with our own and frightened eyes. The fascination of these massive weapons was their name, the earthquake bombs, a title that suggested a power beyond the reach of any conventional and heavy armor. The secret flaw of our deck protection was that it was designed to deflect shells fired from the horizon, not a 6-ton spear falling from the edge of the atmosphere. We heard the reports from the previous raids, stories of how the near misses could buckle the very plates of the hull through the shockwaves in the water. The fascination of the science was a cold reality, as we realized that the British had built a weapon specifically designed to dismantle our giant piece by piece. We felt like a target on a shooting range, a stationary mountain of iron that was being used to test the limits of human destruction and aerial precision. The Tirpitz was a queen without a crown, her majesty replaced by the clinical and calculated focus of a squadron of bombers that had made her their only obsession. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's internal communication during those final tense weeks of October and early November in the year of 1944. The fascination of the bridge was the flow of reconnaissance reports, each one confirming that the British Lancasters were moving their bases closer to our secret position. The psychological weight of the known presence was a heavy burden, as the secrecy that had protected us for years had finally been stripped away by the Allied air power. We saw the fear in the eyes of the younger officers, a reflection of the same dread that was growing in the hearts of the seasoned veterans below. The fascination of the routine was our only anchor, the mechanical repetition of drills and inspections that kept the panic from boiling over into the cold and dark corridors. We were a ship of 3,000 souls, all vibrating with the same unspoken question: when will the sky finally fall upon the lonely queen? The air was thick with the scent of diesel and the cold ozone of the Arctic, a sensory reminder that our time was a currency that was rapidly running out. The fascination with the first tallboy raid at Tromsø was the terrifying realization that our artificial smokescreens were no longer enough to hide our massive and gray silhouette. The psychological weight of the first impact was a physical earthquake that threw men against the bulkheads and shattered the glass of the precision optical rangefinders. The secret flaw of the smoke was the wind, which swept the green mist away at the critical moment, leaving the giant exposed to the bomb aimers high above. We saw the massive geysers of mud and water rising like towers of liquid earth, a sign that the bombs were striking the seabed right next to our hull. The fascination of the damage was the internal shock, as the vibration of the near misses began to shake the very rivets out of the steel frames of the ship. We were being rattled to pieces by a force that didn't even need a direct hit to wound us. A psychological and physical assault that was terrifyingly effective. The Tirpitz groaned under the pressure, a sound like a dying animal that echoed through the lower compartments and the engine rooms where the men worked in the dark. I remember the secret flaw of the ship's anti-aircraft defense, which was magnificent in its volume but struggled to reach the extreme altitude of the specialized British bomber squadrons. The fascination of the tracers was a beautiful and lethal light show, a wall of fire that we hoped would force the Lancasters to drop their heavy cargo too early. The psychological weight of the altitude gap was a source of frustration for the gunners, who watched the planes circling like vultures just out of the reach of our shells. The fascination of the struggle was the duel between the ground and the sky, a vertical war where we were the stationary target and the enemy was a moving shadow in the clouds. We realized then that the lonely queen was being hunted with a precision that turned our size into a disadvantage, a massive bullseye for the most advanced bombers in the world. Every burst of our flak was a scream of defiance, but the sky remained indifferent to our anger and our desperation as the bombs continued to fall from the heights. The psychological weight of the sinking-in-place fear was a constant conversation among the engineers who monitored the rising water in the bilge pumps after every raid. The fascination of the ship's buoyancy was a fragile thing, a balance of air and iron that was being slowly tipped by the shockwaves of the near misses in the silt. The secret flaw of the Tromsø berth was revealed as the sandbank began to shift under the weight of the explosions, creating an uneven foundation for the hull. We felt the ship lift slightly to the port side, a movement that was small but carried the terrifying weight of a final and total and catastrophic capsize. The fascination of the engineering was our only hope, a desperate effort to counter flood and stabilize the giant before the next wave of bombers arrived on the horizon. We were a fortress on a sinking island, a queen who was losing the very ground she stood on to the violence of the sky and the treachery of the sand. The Tirpitz was a masterpiece of steel that was being defeated by the very element she was built to rule, a tragedy of scale that was unfolding in slow motion. I often think about the secret flaw of the Luftwaffe's absence during those final raids, a betrayal that left the Tirpitz to face the fury of the RAF without any fighter cover at all. The fascination of the abandoned giant was a bitter pill for the crew, who felt that the High Command had already written us off as a lost and useless and expensive cause. The psychological weight of the empty sky was a silence that spoke volumes about the state of the German war machine in the winter of 1944. We saw the Lancasters coming, and we waited for our own fighters to intercept them. But the horizon remained clear, and the sun remained cold and indifferent to our plight. The fascination of our isolation was absolute. We were truly the lonely queen, abandoned by her own protectors and left to fend for herself in a world of fire and iron. We were a symbol of a nation that was retreating on every front, a giant that had been left behind to serve as a distraction for the hunters. Every minute that passed without the sound of friendly engines was a minute that brought the final and violent end one step closer to our deck. The fascination with the psychological atmosphere of the final night was a calm and eerie acceptance that the end was no longer a possibility, but a certainty written in the stars. The psychological weight of the final letter home was a burden carried by every man on board, a chance to say the things that had been left unsaid during the long and silent years. The secret flaw of our hope was its fragility, a thin thread that was being pulled apart by the reality of the damage and the persistence of the British bombers. We sat in the mess and spoke of the green fields of Germany, a distant world that felt like a dream compared to the cold and metallic reality of the fjord. The fascination of the Brotherhood was its strength, a bond of 3,000 men who had shared the frost, the fog, and the fire of the lonely queen for so long. We were the crew of the Tirpitz, and we were prepared to stay with her until the very end, whether that end was a victory or a tomb of iron and salt. The air was still, the water was dark, and the giant was resting for the last time before the sky would fall for good. As the third part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the Tirpitz remains a study in the slow and agonizing death of a naval giant in the dark and cold north. The psychological weight of her presence was gone, replaced by the reality of her vulnerability and the persistence of the hunters who had finally cornered her in the sand. The secret flaw of the lonely queen was her loneliness itself, a lack of support that left her to face the fury of a nation alone in the shallow water of Tromsø. We prepared for the final morning, but we knew in our hearts that the sun would not be the only thing to break the horizon in the coming and silent and dark hours. The fascination of the history is the way it narrows down to a single ship and a single fate, a tragedy of scale that was about to reach its thunderous and violent and final climax. We were the crew of the Tirpitz, and we were standing on the edge of the abyss, waiting for the mountain of steel to fall for the very last time into the mud. The fascination with the morning of November 12, 1944, began with a sky so clear and blue that it felt like a cruel trick of the Arctic autumn. The psychological weight of the total visibility was a death sentence for the KMS Tirpitz, as the lack of clouds meant the Lancaster bombers would have a perfect and unobstructed view of our hull. The secret flaw of our final defense was the failure of the smokescreen to deploy in time, leaving the gray giant standing out like a mountain of iron against the dark water of the fjord. We saw the first wave of 32 bombers appearing over the mountain peaks, their silver wings glinting in the cold sunlight as they prepared their long and steady and lethal run. The fascination of the approach was the silence, as the distance was still too great for our guns to bark, leaving us to watch our own destruction descend from the heavens. We felt the psychological weight of the inevitable, a collective holding of breath by 3,000 men who knew that this was the final and ultimate test of the ship. Every second felt like a minute, a slow-motion countdown to a catastrophe that had been years in the making under the shadow of the Norwegian cliffs. I remember the secret flaw of the first direct hit, a 6-ton tallboy bomb that struck the ship amidships and tore through the heavy deck armor like it was made of thin and brittle glass. The fascination of the explosion was its sheer volcanic power, a force that lifted the 50,000-ton battleship and slammed it back down into the shifting and unstable sand. The psychological weight of the jolt was enough to snap the internal bulkheads and throw men across the engine rooms like rag dolls in a hurricane of steel and steam. We heard the scream of the metal as the bomb penetrated deep into the guts of the ship, before detonating with a roar that felt like the end of the world itself. The fascination of the carnage was the sight of the massive 15-inch turrets being shifted on their mountings, their precision gears mangled by the shock waves of the earthquake bomb. We were being dismantled from the inside out, a giant whose heart was being shattered by a spear thrown from the edge of the very atmosphere we had tried to guard. The Tirpitz groaned, a sound of agony that vibrated through every plate of Krupp steel and into the very marrow of our aching and terrified bones. The psychological weight of the second and third impacts followed almost immediately, as the British pilots corrected their aim and concentrated their fury on our burning and broken superstructure. The fascination of the successive strikes was the total collapse of the ship's internal communications, leaving each compartment to fight its own lonely and dark war against the rising water. The secret flaw of our stability was the massive open spaces of the hangar and the midships area, which began to fill with the freezing sea through the jagged holes in the hull. We saw the water rushing in, a dark and oily tide that extinguished the emergency lights and left us in a world of shadows and the smell of toxic cordite. The fascination of the List was its speed, a sudden and terrifying heel to the port side that made walking on the decks an impossible struggle against gravity. We realized then that the sandbank had failed to hold us, its soft foundation giving way under the pressure of the explosions and the weight of the dying and heavy giant. The Tirpitz was no longer a ship. She was a sinking mountain, a queen who was finally being pulled down into the mud and the salt of the deep. I often think about the secret flaw of the internal hatches, which were jammed shut by the warping of the ship's frame, trapping hundreds of men in the lower decks as the water rose. The fascination of the horror was the sound of the banging on the steel, a rhythmic and desperate plea for help that echoed through the dark and flooding corridors of the ship. The psychological weight of the helplessness was absolute, as the damage control parties found themselves unable to reach the trapped sailors through the twisted and burning and mangled iron. We watched as the List increased to 30 degrees, a point of no return where the massive weight of the armored turrets began to pull the ship even faster toward the abyss. The fascination of the mechanical failure was the way the great ship seemed to be fighting against herself, her own defensive armor now acting as a lethal weight to drag her under the waves. We were a crew divided by iron walls, a community of brothers being separated by the very steel that was supposed to be our sanctuary and our home. Every minute brought the final roll closer, a slow and majestic descent into a nightmare of water and darkness and the cold of the north. The fascination with the terminal roll was the moment the Tirpitz reached 45 degrees and the massive sea turret, weighing over 1,000 tons, literally fell out of its barbette and into the sea. The psychological weight of that sound, the roar of the falling turret, was a signal to everyone that the lonely queen was finally and truly and utterly defeated by the power of the sky. The secret flaw of the battleship design was the lack of internal buoyancy once the main deck was submerged, turning the ship into a heavy and top-heavy cage for the men inside. We felt the giant move, a slow and relentless rotation that turned the world sideways and made the sky a distant and unreachable and beautiful dream of light. The fascination of the capsize was its inevitability, a physical law that no amount of courage or Yamato spirit could ever hope to delay or to change in the dark. We were sliding toward the end, a human avalanche of sailors and equipment falling toward the port side, as the ocean rushed in to claim the remains of our pride. The Tirpitz was rolling over, her massive red belly facing the sun for the first time in her long and secret and lonely life in the fjords. I remember the secret flaw of the air pockets, which were the only thing keeping the ship from sinking into the silt entirely, leaving her bottom exposed above the surface of the shallow water. The fascination of the position was its grotesqueness, a dead giant lying upside down in the mud like a bloated and metallic whale that had been cast out by the sea. The psychological weight of being inside the hull as it turned over was a total disorientation, a world where the floor became the ceiling and the water came from every direction at once. We felt the final thud as the superstructure hit the seabed, a jolt that signaled the end of our movement and the beginning of our entombment in the dark. The fascination of the silence that followed was absolute, a quiet that was broken only by the sound of the water lapping against the hull and the distant cries of the survivors on the surface. We were the ghosts of the Tirpitz, trapped in a steel tomb that was half submerged in the cold and indifferent and silent and dark and gray Arctic Sea. The lonely queen had found her final resting place, a secret buried in the mud of Tromsø, a tragedy of scale that was finally and fully and violently complete. The psychological weight of the rescue operation began as the survivors on the surface realized that hundreds of their brothers were still alive inside the overturned and hollow hull. The fascination of the desperation was the sight of men using hand tools and blowtorches to cut through the thick and heavy bottom plating to reach the air pockets below. The secret flaw of the rescue was the time. The freezing water was rising inside the ship, and the air was rapidly becoming toxic with the fumes of the diesel and the breath of the trapped. We heard the sounds of the saws through the steel, a thin and high-pitched scream of hope that was our only connection to the world of the living above. The fascination of the labor was the total focus of the rescuers, who worked through the night under the pale light of the Arctic stars to save as many as they could. We were a ship of 3,000, but in those hours, every single life was a treasure that was being fought for with a ferocity that defied the cold and the exhaustion. The Tirpitz was a tomb, but for a few hundred lucky souls, she was a tomb that would eventually be opened by the hands of their brothers. I often think about the secret flaw of the psychological trauma for those who were cut out of the hull. The experience of being born back into the world through a hole in the bottom of a battleship. The fascination of the light was its intensity, a blinding and beautiful glare that signaled the end of the darkness and the beginning of a life we never expected to see again. The psychological weight of the survivor's guilt was a heavy burden, as we realized that for every man pulled through the hole, 2 more were left behind in the rising and cold and dark and oily water. We watched as the rescue efforts were eventually forced to stop, the ship having settled too deep into the mud for any more holes to be cut in the steel. The fascination of the finality was a quiet and somber realization that the Lonely Queen would now be the permanent home for nearly 1,000 of our brave and loyal and fallen friends. We were the remnants of a legend, a crew without a ship, standing on the shore and looking at the red belly of the monster that had been our world for so long. The Tirpitz was gone, her story written in the blood and the iron and the salt of the Tromsø fjord. The fascination with the British reaction to the sinking was a mixture of triumph and a strange sense of relief that the Lonely Queen would never haunt their convoys or their nightmares again. The psychological weight of the end of the hunt was felt in London and on the decks of every Allied battleship that had been tied down by the Tirpitz's existence. The secret flaw of our mission was now clear. We had been a distraction, a massive and expensive decoy that had failed to save the Empire. It was built to protect from the fire. We saw the newsreels of the Lancasters returning home, their pilots heroes of the nation, while we were the forgotten prisoners of a war that was already lost in the dark. The fascination of the contrast was a bitter pill, a realization that our secretive presence had finally been overcome by the persistence and the ingenuity of a superior and determined and focused enemy. We were the ghosts of a vanished era, the sailors of a battleship that had been outlived by the technology of the sky and the power of the heavy lift and lethal and precise and earthquake bombs. As the 4th part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the Tirpitz remains a study in the violent and tragic end of a naval giant in the shallow water of the North. The psychological weight of her presence was gone, replaced by the physical reality of her overturned hull and the silence of the nearly 1,000 men who stayed inside. The secret flaw of the Lonely Queen was revealed in her final role, that even the strongest armor cannot protect a ship from the weight of her own reputation and the persistence of her hunters. We are the guardians of her final moments, the ones who remember the sound of the roll and the cold of the water as the world turned sideways for the very last time. The fascination of the history is the way it closes the door on the era of the battleship, a final and thunderous and violent and tragic goodbye to the age of the giants. We were the crew of the Tirpitz, and we were the witnesses to the death of a queen, a story of iron and fire that would haunt the fjords of Norway forever. The fascination with the silence that followed the sinking was a physical weight that pressed down on the survivors huddled on the cold, rocky shores of Tromsø. The psychological weight of seeing the Lonely Queen upside down, her massive red-painted belly exposed to the pale Arctic sun, was a sight that shattered our remaining sense of invincibility. The secret flaw of the German naval command was the immediate and total abandonment of the crew once the ship was no longer a functional asset to the dying Reich. We were left in the freezing mud, 1,000 broken men without a home, watching as the black oil from our ship's heart began to spread across the water. The fascination of the carnage was the lack of orders. For the first time in years, the rigid discipline of the Tirpitz was replaced by a hollow and terrifying freedom. We realized then that the empire we served was as hollow as the air pockets keeping the overturned hull afloat in the shallow and murky and silent water. Every man was a ghost, stripped of his purpose and his queen, standing in the ruins of a legend that had finally reached its thunderous and tragic end. I remember the secret flaw of the official report sent to Berlin, which tried to downplay the scale of the disaster to avoid a total collapse of naval morale. The fascination of the propaganda was its total disconnection from the reality of the nearly 1,000 men who were still entombed in the Iron Mountain behind us. The psychological weight of the silent sacrifice was a bitter burden, as we were ordered to remain quiet about the horrors of the final and violent roll into the mud. We saw the bodies being pulled from the water, unrecognizable under the thick layer of black fuel oil that made every man look like a shadow of his former self. The fascination of the recovery was the mechanical coldness of the process, a final and grim accounting of the lives that had been spent to protect a ship that couldn't move. We felt the psychological weight of the betrayal, a realization that we were just cogs in a machine that was being dismantled by the persistence of a superior and focused and vengeful enemy. The Tirpitz was a tomb, and we were the unwanted witnesses to its closing, a secret that the High Command wanted to bury along with the steel. The psychological weight of the survivor's guilt began to take root as we were moved to temporary barracks, away from the sight of the overturned hull and the cries of the rescue workers. The fascination of the trauma was the way we couldn't stop looking back at the fjord, expecting the giant to somehow right itself and return to the light of the living. The secret flaw of our survival was the knowledge that we had made it to the deck, while our closest friends were trapped in the dark and rising water of the lower decks. We spoke in whispers, our voices cracking under the pressure of the memories of the banging on the steel and the scream of the falling tallboy bombs. The fascination of the silence was a heavy thing, a quiet that was filled with the ghosts of the men we had left behind in the labyrinth of the armored and flooded hull. We were a crew without a ship, a collection of individuals who had lost their collective soul to the mud of Tromsø and the precision of the British Royal Air Force. Every day was a struggle to find a reason to continue, a battle against the realization that our lonely queen had died a lonely and agonizing and cold and dark death. I often think about the secret flaw of the local Norwegian people's reaction, which was a mixture of quiet relief and a deep, somber respect for the men who had died in their waters. The fascination of the occupation silence was broken as they saw the giant fall, a symbol of their own and long-awaited liberation from the shadow of the German occupation. The psychological weight of being the enemy in a foreign land was intensified by the sight of the Norwegians watching us from the hills, their faces unreadable and cold as the granite cliffs. We realized then that the Tirpitz had been a cage for them as much as it had been a sanctuary for us, a mountain of iron that had dominated their lives and their landscape for 3 long and dark years. The fascination of the shared history was a tragic one, a bond of salt and fire that had linked our fates together in the narrow and deep waters of the Arctic fjords. We were leaving their shores as defeated men, carrying the weight of a secret that would now belong to the history books and the shifting sands of the Tromsø seabed. The fascination with the scrapping rumors began almost immediately, as the Norwegian government and private contractors realized the immense value of the Krupp steel lying just beneath the surface. The psychological weight of seeing our ship being cannibalized for parts was a final insult to the men who had spent their youth maintaining her proud and heavy and polished armor. The secret flaw of the ship's afterlife was her transformation from a weapon of war into a source of raw materials for the reconstruction of a broken and peaceful world. We heard stories of the steel being used for bridges, for hospitals, and even for the very roads that would eventually lead the world away from the memory of the war. The fascination of the recycling was a strange irony. The metal that was meant to kill was now being used to heal and to rebuild the very cities we had once threatened with our guns. We felt the psychological weight of the obsolescence, a realization that the era of the battleship was truly over, replaced by the practical and quiet and industrial needs of the coming and uncertain peace. I remember the secret flaw of the final departure from Norway, a journey in a crowded and cold transport ship that felt like a funeral procession for the entire German surface fleet. The fascination of the horizon was its emptiness, a lack of the massive silhouette that had defined our world for so long in the north and in our dreams. The psychological weight of the return to Germany was the shock of seeing our own cities in ruins, a reflection of the same destruction we had witnessed on the deck of the Tirpitz. We realized that our lonely queen had been a distraction from the true catastrophe happening at home, a mountain of steel that had consumed the nation's lifeblood while the sky was falling elsewhere. The fascination of the contrast was absolute. We had protected a fjord while the world was being burned to the ground by a fire we couldn't stop or even reach. We were the veterans of a forgotten front, the sailors of a ship that had been outlived by the very war she was built to win and to dominate with her presence. Every mile we traveled toward the south was a mile further into the realization that our sacrifice had been a secret that no one wanted to hear or to remember. The psychological weight of the Tirpitz Association was the only thing that kept the survivors together in the chaotic and dark months following the final surrender of the German Reich in 1945. The fascination of our bond was its exclusivity, a feeling that no one else could understand the smell of the green smoke or the sound of the Lancaster's heavy and lethal and precise engines. The secret flaw of our reintegration was the shame associated with the Navy that had failed to protect the giant, a burden we carried into the new and divided world of the post-war era. We met in secret at first, sharing photos and memories of the lonely queen, as if she were a lost lover or a vanished and beautiful and tragic part of our own and broken souls. The fascination of the reunions was the way the ship grew in our minds, her flaws being smoothed over by the passage of time and the selective memory of the brave and the loyal. We were the Tirpitz men, a breed apart, the keepers of a flame that the world wanted to extinguish in the name of a new and modern and democratic and peaceful identity. Every year we met, the circle grew smaller, but the weight of the steel remained as heavy as the day it first hit the mud. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's remaining hull, which stayed upside down in the Tromsø fjord for years, a metallic island that became a local landmark for the people who had once feared it. The fascination of the dead monster was its permanence, a physical fact that refused to disappear even after the war had ended, and the world had moved on to the next crisis. The psychological weight of the wreckage was a reminder of the power of the past, a silent sermon on the futility of size and the persistence of the hunters who never lost the scent. We saw photos of children playing on the exposed bottom plating, unaware of the nearly 1,000 men who were still resting in the dark and quiet compartments beneath their feet. The fascination of the desecration was a sharp pain for the survivors, a feeling that our home was being treated as a curiosity rather than a sacred and tragic and monumental and naval grave. We realized then that the Tirpitz was no longer ours. She belonged to the sea, to the Norwegians, and to the historians who would pick apart her story for the rest of all time. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ship's electrical systems was revealed during the scrapping, as contractors found cables that were still carrying a charge from the batteries that had survived the final roll. The psychological weight of the ghost power was an eerie thought, as if the ship was still trying to maintain her heartbeat even after she had been dismantled and abandoned by the world. The fascination of the Endurance was a testament to the quality of the German craftsmanship, a machine that refused to truly die even when her spirit had been crushed by the sky. We heard stories of the scrap workers hearing voices in the empty hangars, a collective hallucination born from the psychological weight of the tragedy that had occurred in those very and dark spaces. The fascination of the haunting was a way to process the loss, a belief that the Tirpitz was more than just steel, but a vessel of the souls who had lived and died within her armored and heavy and cold walls. We were the ghosts of the living, and she was the ghost of the dead, a connection that would never be broken by the saws or the torches of the reconstruction. As the fifth part of our story reaches its conclusion, the fascination with the Tirpitz remains a study in the long and slow and agonizing transformation from a legend into a memory in the dark. The psychological weight of her presence was gone, replaced by the reality of her physical absence and the silence of the nearly 1,000 men who stayed inside the iron tomb. The secret flaw of the lonely queen was revealed in her afterlife, that a ship is only as strong as the history that remembers her, and her history was one of fear, isolation, and a tragic end. We are the guardians of her transition, the ones who remember the sound of the final roll and the cold of the water as the world turned sideways for the very last time. The fascination of the history is the way it slowly erases the violence and replaces it with the quiet and somber reflection of the years that followed the storm. We were the crew of the Tirpitz, and we were the witnesses to the death of a queen, a story of iron and fire that would haunt the fjords of Norway until the end of time. The fascination with the legacy of the KMS Tirpitz is the profound echoing silence she left in the fjords, a void that was once filled by the most terrifying silhouette of the Atlantic War. The psychological weight of the lonely queen remains a chilling study in the power of a threat that never fully manifested, a giant that conquered through the fear of what she might do. The secret flaw of her existence was the paradox of her power. She was so valuable to the German Reich that she became too precious to risk, ultimately spending her life as a majestic prisoner of her own heavy armor. We look at the rust-colored water of Tromsø today and see a mirror of the era of the great battleships, immense, beautiful, and utterly vulnerable to the changing winds of technology and the sky. The fascination of the Tirpitz is her tragic stillness, a queen who wore a crown of mist and a robe of iron, only to be dismantled by the very persistence of the world she sought to intimidate. We were the crew of a nightmare, and even as the world moved into the age of jets and nuclear fire, the cold weight of her 50,000-ton memory stayed anchored in our souls. The psychological weight of the secret flaw in our national pride was the struggle to reconcile the brilliance of her engineering with the ultimate futility of her long and lonely and stationary life. The fascination of the Tirpitz today is found in the scattered fragments of her hull, pieces of Krupp steel that have been repurposed into manhole covers and bridge supports across the Norwegian landscape. We see the jagged rocks where she once rested, and we remember the vibration of the turbines and the smell of the artificial fog that used to hide us from the stars. The fascination of her story is the transition from a symbol of terror into a source of utility, a monster of war that was literally ground down to build the foundations of a peaceful and modern society. We carry the memory of the green mist as a sacred trust, a reminder of a time when a single ship could hold the destiny of thousands of merchant sailors in her cold and silent and armored hands. The giant is gone, but her shadow is a permanent part of the granite cliffs, a ghost of the north that will never truly be erased by the passing of the long and quiet years. I remember the secret flaw of the first time I saw a piece of Tirpitz steel in a museum. A jagged fragment of the deck that still carried the scars of the Tallboy's earthquake-like and violent and sudden impact. The fascination of the metal was its coldness, a physical connection to the morning when the sky fell and the world turned sideways in a roar of steam and salt. The psychological weight of that object was a bridge to the men who didn't make it out, a reminder that for every ton of steel salvaged, a story of a lost brother was left behind in the mud. We saw the tourists looking at the artifacts with a distant curiosity, unaware of the terror of the roll or the sound of the water rushing into the lightless and freezing and oily compartments. The fascination of the lonely queen is that she remains a mystery to those who didn't live under her shadow, a legend of a war that was fought in the dark and the frost. We are the ones who know the truth of the iron, the ones who felt the giant breathe before she was silenced by the persistence of an obsessed and vengeful and powerful enemy. The psychological weight of the secret flaw in our survival is the question of why we were chosen to walk back into the light while the queen remained in the dark of the Tromsø seabed. The fascination of the survivor's guilt is a companion that grows heavier as the anniversaries pass, and the number of men who remember the green smoke continues to dwindle towards zero. We see the faces of the young engineers who stayed at their posts to keep the lights burning until the final second, their loyalty a flame that was extinguished by the cold and rising tide. The fascination of the Tirpitz is their story, the story of a crew that maintained a masterpiece of war for years without ever getting the chance to prove her worth in a fair and open fight. We are the guardians of their names, the ones who must ensure that the lonely queen is remembered as a human tragedy, and not just a cold and technical footnote in a naval history book. The ship was a tomb, but she was also the center of our universe, a mountain of steel that defined who we were and what we were willing to endure for the sake of the iron. I often think about the secret flaw of the underwater memorials that have been placed where the ship once lay. Simple markers in the silt that honor the nearly 1,000 souls who stayed with the hull. The fascination of the sight is its tranquility, a quiet that is a stark and beautiful contrast to the violence of the earthquake bombs and the scream of the Lancaster engines. The psychological weight of the water at Tromsø is a shield that preserves the memory of the giant, keeping her safe from the noise and the distractions of a world that has moved on to new and different wars. We imagine the deep-sea life colonizing the remains of the superstructure, turning the weapons of destruction into a sanctuary for the creatures of the salt and the dark. The fascination of her end is a peace that she never knew in life, a rest that was earned through the long and agonizing years of isolation and the final and thunderous and tragic roll. The Tirpitz is at rest, a queen of the abyss, finally free from the burdens of her reputation and the weight of the empire she was built to protect and to serve. The fascination with the secret flaw of the Tirpitz's story is that it serves as the ultimate cautionary tale about the limits of size and the vulnerability of the stationary and the isolated and the proud. The psychological weight of her history is a lesson in the evolution of warfare, the moment when the heavy-lift bomber finally and decisively ended the reign of the armored battleship. We see the same patterns repeating in the world today, the struggle to adapt to new threats and the danger of relying on the massive and the old and the slow-moving and the obvious. The fascination of the ship is its relevance, a story of a fleet in being that reminds us that influence is often more about presence and psychological pressure than it is about the fire of the guns. We were the victims of that transition, the men who stood on the deck of a vanishing era and watched as the future arrived in the form of a 6-ton bomb from the high and indifferent sky. The Tirpitz was a ghost ship before she ever sank, a vessel that was haunted by the impossibility of her own survival in a world that had learned how to make the mountains fall. I remember the secret flaw of the final salute we gave to the Fjords when the last of the salvage operations was completed and the water was finally clear of the jagged and rusted and broken steel. The fascination of the ceremony was its finality, a closing of the book on a chapter of iron and fire that had dominated the northern horizon for nearly a decade of war and peace. The psychological weight of the empty water was a physical sensation, a feeling that a part of our own bodies had been removed along with the remains of the battleship we loved. We saw the surface of the fjord return to its mirror-like and still and quiet state, as if the giant had never been there at all, a ghost that had finally vanished back into the mist. The fascination of the erasure was a mercy, a chance for the land to heal and for the people to forget the terror that had once anchored in their very and beautiful and cold and deep front yard. We were the last ones who could still see the silhouette against the mountains, the ones who knew that the Queen was still there in spirit, guarding the secrets of the long and lonely winter. The psychological weight of the secret flaw in our legacy is that the Tirpitz is often remembered as a failure, when she was actually the most successful psychological weapon of the entire German naval campaign. The fascination of the successful ghost is a story that defies the usual metrics of victory, a ship that won her battles by simply refusing to fight them until the very end of her life. We don't need the world to celebrate her cannons. We only need the sea to remember the weight of the steel and the fear that she cast over the Arctic convoys for 3 long and bloody years. The fascination of the lonely queen is her complexity, a story that grows more haunting as we realize the scale of the obsession she triggered in the hearts of her most determined and focused and vengeful enemies. She was the shadow of the Bismarck, the last and most majestic of the giants, and the most tragic secret of the Kriegsmarine's final and desperate and dark and cold and silent and heavy end. The Tirpitz is a ghost, and we are the haunted, and the story of our long watch in the fjords is a flame that will burn in the dark forever. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ocean's memory is that it preserves the essence of the ship even after the last of her rivets has been pulled from the mud and the silt of Tromsø. The psychological weight of the history is a physical fact that remains unchanged by the passing of the years or the changing of the guard in the halls of the great and powerful navies. We imagine the sound of the polar wind moving through the mountain passes, a sound that still carries the echo of the ship's daily and rhythmic and disciplined and heavy and metallic and cold life. The fascination of her state is her eternity, an existence that is no longer tied to the iron but to the legends and the nightmares and the stories of the men who sailed her into the mist. We are the last link to that lonely queen, the only ones who can still feel the vibration of her turbines and the cold of the Norwegian saltwater on our skin. The psychological weight of the history is a light that shines on the truth of our isolation and the scale of our tragic and monumental and naval and lonely failure. As the epic and haunting story of the KMS Tirpitz and the hunt for the lonely Queen of the North reaches its final and quiet end, please consider subscribing for more naval mysteries. We are dedicated to telling the stories of the giants that the world forgot and the men who lived in the shadows of the most colossal and tragic and beautiful and heavy and dark naval failures. The fascination with the ghost of the fjords is a tribute to the power of psychological warfare and the incredible and silent price of being the most hunted ship in the world. Comment below. Do you believe the Tirpitz was a wasted resource, or was her secretive presence worth the immense cost of her life and her final and violent and tragic end? Share this story of secrecy and isolation to help us keep the memory of the Queen of the North alive for a new and curious and modern generation of history seekers. Your support allows us to explore the secret flaws of history and bring the silent terrors of the deep back into the light of the modern and busy and noisy and living world.